Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on web governance. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items here. As I'm sure you know, this presentation will be recorded and made available to you after the fact. We'll also have some time towards the end for a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the chat. If we don't have time to get to all of the questions, we'll be happy to follow up via email as well. But please don't be shy and ask away. We have a fantastic presenter for you today, Georgy Cohen from Oho Interactive. Georgy, would you like to briefly introduce yourself to the attendees?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, everybody. I'm Georgy Cohen. I am the Director of Digital Strategy at Oho Interactive. I work on our web solutions team, leading strategy efforts for website projects. I manage our digital strategy and content strategy team. I've been at Oho for almost 10 years, but I've been working in higher ed since 2004, both in-house and as a consultant.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm Kat Liendgens. I'm the CEO here at Hannon Hill, and we're the team behind Cascade CMS. So Georgy will be leading much of our session today, and I will chime in to talk about how you can use your CMS to help create and maintain a web governance framework. And I realize that we have a mixture here of Cascade users and some organizations that are currently using a different tool. Totally fine with that. So we'll try to keep it somewhat high level, but also point out some of the things that you might want to look for if you are considering a new product. And then we'll also show you some things that you as Cascade users may not be leveraging fully currently, and how to improve on that. So note that due to time constraints, given all the things that we need to talk about today, we might not be able to cover everything CMS related, but it's a good starting point. Now, as we proceed, we do encourage you to view our discussion from a bit of a different, fresh perspective, because one of the main takeaways we would like you to have from today's webinar is that, contrary to popular belief, web governance isn't just about setting limits and restricting abilities and access. It's also about educating and empowering your content creators. And so you want to enable them to produce more effective and impactful content.
Excellent. Thanks, Kat. I'm going to get things kicked off here. This kind of gives a little bit of a overview of what we'll be talking about today. Definitely going to leave you at the end also with some action items. So things that you could do now, soon, and in the future to sort of get yourself thinking more about your governance. And I really appreciate that comment about governance being about education and empowerment. I think governance gets a bad rap for basically being new and exciting ways to say no. But it should really be new and exciting ways to ensure that the right content gets created the right way for the greatest impact. So we're just going to start by explaining a little bit about what governance is. Why is this the thing that we're talking about? Why are so many of you here today to learn about this? So one thing that, I think that, many institutions deal with is a digital landscape that looks something like this. You just have stuff everywhere, kind of disorganized. You might have random groups creating microsites over here, people creating pages over there, people getting access to the CMS here, people having access to edit these critical pages over here. Not a lot of rhyme or reason to things, not a lot of process in place to say that something is okay or not okay, or the right way to do something, or who to ask, or having roles that work within a given system. So there's kind of some flavor of chaos like this might look unfortunately familiar to some of you. So we often find ourselves in a position at Oho. We're a full source digital agency working primarily with higher education. We do design and development, strategy, research, and digital marketing, including development in Cascade. And we often start projects and look at some version of this where it's a little bit chaotic. And that's where we start asking questions about governance. What governance really entails is creating an insurance policy for the investment that you're making in your digital platforms and providing structure and accountability towards achieving your communications goals. A communication goal is not just a wish your heart makes. It's something that you have to sort of put into action actually and make sure that it be accountable to that. Governance helps you stay accountable to those goals. And you think about the resources spent on and time spent on staffing, on redesign projects, on buying CMS platforms, all these things that you do that are a significant investment. If you don't have the rules in place to make sure they're being utilized in the most impactful and efficient way, it ends up squandering resources. And often higher ed does not have a lot of resources to squander. So it really helps with efficiency as well. And governance, I think, is really rooted in my mind in purpose. It's making sure that the things that you're doing are purposeful, are intentional, are aligned to with the goal of achieving something. And that is all aspects of governance, the roles that you need, whether or not we should have this new page or have this new site, how we measure success, whether or not we should allocate resources to a new idea or a new something that somebody wants. Making sure that we're empowering site editors and educating them to fulfill that role purposefully, and setting priorities that we're aligning to. This is an example from a Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, from their web governance policies, helpfully found on their website, and they root it in goals and audience. It's the foundation of content strategy. It's the foundation of governance. You have to know, okay, we're trying to achieve these things to engage these audiences. Great. Governance is the guidelines and the sort of guardrails that help us hold us accountable to those objectives. And really what a thoughtful web governance framework is doing is helping guide us into how to mitigate chronic website issues through cultural change and improved processes. So whenever you think about an issue you see on a website, there's out-of-date content, the content quality is poor, there's some other issue, right? It's usually tied to an organizational issue. Someone didn't have the right training. Someone thinks the CMS is really hard to use or doesn't know how to use it and just doesn't want to do it. Somebody doesn't have the time in their job to do that website task that their boss keeps asking them to do. Governance solutions, by addressing really those organizational issues at the root, are served to help mitigate those website issues. And as we know, organizational issues are really tied into the culture of the organization. So that helps us transition to thinking about some of the unique considerations for governance in higher ed, because again, organizational issues are website issues. You might have legacy platforms, roles, processes. This is the way we've always done things since we launched our website in 1997. We've had these roles. We've done it this way. This group has owned it. This is how it's been. Politics, right? Is the website a hot potato? Are there lots of politics that end up influencing what content goes where and how decisions are made, or who owns what sections of the website? Decentralization. Many institutions are highly decentralized, and if that decentralization is reflected in the website, it can create a really fractured user experience because users don't care about your org chart. And if your org chart is very decentralized, resulting in a very fractured web presence, your users are going to react negatively to that. Silos. So if you have groups that don't talk to each other, groups that are not connected to support one another, there's still an unfortunate amount of institutions out there where the marketing team does not work closely with admissions, or the colleges are all disconnected and doing their own thing. That can create liabilities. Lack of clear and nimble decision making. One of the most important things is being able to know where does the buck stop, right? Who is the owner? Who's deciding what goes on the homepage? Who's deciding, if we're going to, buy this tool to incorporate into our website? How are these decisions made, and who ultimately owns those decisions? When we don't have a clear decision-making process, that's where you can have a lot of confusion arise in many different ways. And lack of accountability. That's something also that can be very common. People having a lot of ideas or having a lot of wishes, or having a lot of goals or things they want done, but they think about what they want, but not creating the structure to facilitate that being achieved in a sustainable way. And fear of change. It's a very human thing to experience, to have that fear of, okay, well now I was a graphic designer, but now the web is here, and how do I adapt to that? Or, well, my role is changing, or now I have to manage this piece of it. We're not thinking about the human aspects of digital work. It's going to impact the quality of the digital work. And then again, the undefined ownership of the web. So when we have these issues kind of swirling around, they have real impacts on the digital experience in terms of what the user's experience and their feeling is going to be like, how those site editors end up feeling, creating bottlenecks or pain points in the process, and ultimately creating gaps or problems on the site. And when we have those things happen, it creates brand friction. It alienates our audiences. It reduces our conversion. So there's a really, really strong business impact when we're thinking about a lack of accountability and process around how the website is managed. If your content is out of date or it's poor quality, that's going to degrade your brand impression. People are going to bounce. If the site doesn't load, people are going to bounce. If they can't find what they want to do, they're going to bounce. If everything feels inconsistent and jarring and fractured, it's going to reduce credibility, reduce confidence in the quality of the experience. People are going to bounce. If editors, again, are untrained or unmotivated and contributing to these problems, it's going to affect, it's going to have a real impact on the business, on the brand perception, and how engaged your audiences are. So let's talk about how some aspects of governance can help us address these factors and mitigate those. So the first thing to think about is really your governance model. Basically, that means how is your website being managed? There's not one right way to do this. It would be almost easier if there were, wouldn't it? So there's kind of a spectrum that we like to think about. On one end, you have centralized. That would be like, we have our team, we own everything on the .edu, our way or the highway. Great. Decentralized. It's farmed out, it's shared, it's distributed across multiple site editors. People have different pieces of the pie. Or some combination, some coordinated or hybrid approach where there's some aspects that are managed centrally and others that are sort of distributed out. Again, you could fall anywhere on this spectrum, but to be successful in that place, you have to think about what each of these models requires to succeed. To succeed as a central model, you need to have the team. You need to have the team and the resources in place to manage the breadth of your .edu. If you're more decentralized and have sort of editors across the organization, that could be fine, but are those people supported? Are they connected to the brand guidelines? Are they trained on the platform, on web content and brand communication? Is there documentation to help guide them? Is there like a peer network, right? So either model can work, but you have to think about what that model requires in order to succeed. Something else that often comes into play when we're thinking about governance models is authoritative content. So not all content is the same. The page about mail services on campus has less value, let's face it, than your tuition and fees page, right? They're both web pages. One is much more of critical business importance than the other. So when we think about authoritative content, we think about content that's really business critical that you would want to be managed centrally, certainly with input from subject matter experts and whatnot. But because of the business critical nature of that content, you really want to make extra sure it meets high standards for accuracy and quality. That could be the history of the college or your program pages, tuition, maybe top level marketing landing pages. But when we're thinking about different content, it's like, what is sort of authoritative? What is more core? Like that could be like your admissions section. Like maybe like the admissions team owns that fully, but that's still core content. And then there's non-core content where you may just kind of care less about it. Like mail services, parking services, here's some training, we're going to support you, good luck. But it's important to sort of think about what content requires and what different content, and how all content is not exactly the same.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the ways in which your CMS can actually enhance and support your web governance framework. So some of the obvious examples here are the CMS can help enforce accessibility standards. It can oversee SEO best practices and also streamline the process to which different users enter and manage content. And then, of course, your CMS can also strengthen governance by implementing certain support features on the back end, like help text, or maybe standardizing file naming conventions, which is often underrated, and also format restrictions. And so these functionalities are really designed to maintain and enforce high standards across your platform and thus ensure a more consistent and compliant web framework. Now, in order to build this governance framework and help your users navigate it, you need to not just carefully determine access rights, like read and write permissions to different things on your site, like sites, folders, pages, but also ideally, you would want to create this custom content entry user interface for each type of user. And with that, I would always say, don't be afraid to go as granular as you need to. For example, it's not just enough to determine, okay, this user can edit this region and this user can edit that region on a page. It can also include things like the ability to maybe flag certain news articles to be included on the homepage, or the ability to use different styling buttons on the WYSIWYG editor. So really go granular when it comes to giving users access rights and abilities. And just as an aside here, I always like to point this out since we're talking about styling here. Remember how important it is to teach your contributors that it's not typically a good idea to rely on styling in order to convey meaning. So taking away some of those styling buttons can actually be a really good teaching tool for them in that regard. And once again, we'll see here, it's a theme that education is key when it comes to web governance. And then also you want to, when you deal with your WYSIWYG editor, you might also want to turn off access to the source code for non-technical users so that you can prevent them from implementing some styling hacks or embedding some third-party snippets. And then also, of course, you want to ensure that your CMS will override any type of styling that is not in your CSS, so that you can be sure that no crazy fonts or colors are used that are not part of your approved branding. And so a practical approach to supporting your content contributors involves really providing them with clearly defined page types and other assets types that use structured data. So by tailoring the number of page types and content blocks based on your site's goals and policies, you can ensure better consistency across all of your sites. And then, of course, another tip here is be sure to set specific default directories for items like news articles and images, because that helps you ensure that these assets are always stored in the correct locations. And this will help you not just streamline the creation of content, but also helps you maintain an organizational structure for your site. And that's going to eventually make it easier for contributors to manage and update content effectively. But we all know, no matter how many guardrails you have in place, there may be times when you have to quickly roll back to a previous version of the page. So you want to be able to see notes about each version so you can quickly identify which version you're currently dealing with or about to roll back to. So we'd recommend having this in place with your CMS, that you have the ability to take notes about each version. And since we completely understand that teaching your contributors to enter notes about what they changed might be a bit of a challenge, Cascade actually adds some smart comments in case users forget to add them or outright refuse to do that. And so this type of version control is very useful, not just so they can revert back to previous versions, but it really can help you understand how your content evolved over time. Now, another way in which a CMS can help with proper web governance involves preventing users from overwriting each other's content. So be sure to adhere to best practices when it comes to checking content in and out. And to me, checking content back in is often overlooked, so that can easily result in perpetually locked pages. So be sure that you have some reports that will alert you to these types of problems. And of course, as I mentioned before, another aspect of the CMS where it can play a major role in web governance is the way that you structure your content entry fields. So in order to be really granular with your permissions, even on an individual page, and also to share pieces of content more strategically and effectively across different pages, and I mean, even across different sites and platforms, my big ask here is please stay away from this giant monolithic WYSIWYG editor, because that'll essentially put your web governance and your ability to share content effectively, put that on ice. So don't do this giant WYSIWYG editor. So instead, you want to break your content and the corresponding content entry fields into smaller, more structured chunks. Again, this is gonna help your contributors because they see only the fields that are relevant to them, so it keeps them focused. And it also gives you a much better way to set yourself up for creating a create once, publish everywhere framework. A quick word about auditing. It's definitely not the most glamorous aspect of web governance, but it's very important. So if there's ever an issue with a page, you want to be able to view the audit trail to see who changed what. And you also want the ability to audit individual users, because that'll help you determine if a user has the correct permissions and allow you to make adjustments accordingly. Because users may actually earn privileges for successfully managing their content. And then on the flip side, audits may also reveal any type of skill gaps that you might have, and maybe reveal the need for additional training for specific users. Another quick thing where CMS can be very powerful is unpublishing, which is just as important as publishing, believe it or not. So when you move or delete content in the CMS, you need to have the ability to decide if you want to unpublish said page from your web server and update links accordingly. And then another very effective use of a CMS is the link and dependency management. So you want to be able to completely rely on your CMS to automatically track links and dependencies between pages and assets. And that, of course, helps in preventing broken links. And it also ensures that content that is related will be updated and reviewed together.
Excellent.
Now, when it comes to giving access to the CMS, a few tips here. Establish the minimum requirements, and this could be something like subject matter expertise or maybe web responsibilities that are clearly outlined in someone's job description. And make access contingent upon training. And this could be, of course, CMS training, but also other aspects like training on how to write content for the web. It's very, very different, as I'm sure you know, to write content for the web compared to writing academic papers. I would also ensure that the managers of content contributors are aware and supportive of a specific contributor's access to the CMS. You want to have that buy-in. And you may also want to set parameters for continued access to the CMS. So I know that some of you have already put processes in place where the user's access gets revoked if they haven't logged into the CMS in a specific time frame, and that's not a bad idea. So keep tracking access and usage to identify gaps that could very well be a result of turnover or a result of insufficient training.
Yep. And one other thing that I would add is, when there's, we have staff turnover often. I feel like we've been hearing that, unfortunately, there's been more turnover in recent months than in the past. When you are keeping track of who has access to the CMS and what parts of the site they're accountable for, when there's staff turnover, and this is where having a relationship with those managers is helpful, you want to make sure that that part of the site continues to be supported. So finding ways to build a system of awareness so that you can have continuity planning to make sure that if someone leaves or there's a gap in staffing, that the website remains supported.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we want to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. So the thing about roles and responsibilities is that there could be overlap, right? So you can have different users occupy a single role type, like editor or publisher, whatever it might be. And then roles can be managed in the aggregate via groups. So in some platforms, you can have, okay, we want to have for only this section of the site, these editors who have this role can edit only that section of the site. And then there's other editors who only have access to that section of the site, for example. There's roles that are sort of CMS online roles, like someone who can edit or publish content, but then there are offline roles too, like legal approval or some other kind of review. So when you're thinking about roles and responsibilities, there's online and offline aspects, and you don't want to necessarily default to what comes out of the box for whatever platform you end up working with. A lot of these platforms are really great, like Cascade, where you can customize the roles and the access to what's relevant to your organization. If you run a small center or a large, large university site, you're going to need a different approach. So make sure to customize that and don't commit to a system that boxes you in. And just to note that, role alone, having a certain access is not enough. You have to define the responsibilities of that role. What is the scope of your influence? What are expectations for sort of providing information or whatnot? And then, of course, making sure that job descriptions, and we emphasized this a minute ago, but this is just part of the thing of making web responsibilities real and codified and truly part of someone's job, not another duty as assigned. This is, a bigger conversation that might involve HR or something. It's definitely your manager, but I'm a big advocate for making website responsibilities real as a real part of someone's job.
Yeah, and we definitely recommend a thorough planning of roles and responsibilities because it will directly affect the way that you set up your groups of users and define what they can and can't do. And then, as Georgie indicated here, also keep in mind that somebody who is an administrator for one site might have a completely different role in another site. And in most cases, those out-of-the-box built-in roles that a lot of CMSs have, they might not be sufficient because your CMS, your organization's needs will be very unique. So we highly recommend defining exactly what those different roles are. And I would say don't limit yourself to just creator, editor, administrator. That's very standard, but I would actually say use the terms that you're also currently using internally because that would make a lot more sense to the individuals. And then you can create custom groups of users as well, which will then help you simplify your user management.
So you think about how different roles might interact in a workflow of how content gets published, and you can see how this might work. You have sort of, sort of solid line dependencies, kind of like direct oversight. Then you have more dotted line influencer dependencies, where people are sort of influencing the process, like a web management board. It's really providing more strategic oversight, maybe not having CMS access at all, but setting priorities, providing budget, things like that. Content contributors and domain stakeholders. Like, I'm the chair of the biology department. I'm going to help you update the biology program website, but I'm not going to have a say in that. So thinking about how those roles, what their responsibilities are, and how they work together in this kind of workflow is really important so that you can understand not just, okay, we have these roles, but here's how they work within the publishing system that's supporting our site.
Yeah, and another key concept of web governance is content ownership. Georgie mentioned accountability, which is key. Content ownership really allows you to keep content contributors on track. And here what you see is a screenshot of the content ownership assignment in Cascade. And this will really help with accountability and allow users to quickly find the pages for which they're responsible. And so if you're not currently using content ownership, definitely recommend considering it because it'll keep contributors more invested and keep them more accountable. And one of the features that is tied to content ownership is the task manager. In Cascade, you actually have the ability to assign tasks either to yourself or to others. And in addition to that, you can link them to specific content assets and assign priorities and due dates. And keep in mind, don't make everything a high priority because then it essentially renders it useless. So these tasks actually show up in the pertinent users dashboard and also in the daily content report email that they receive. So we promote the use of the daily content email report because we find it to be a very, very effective tool to get contributors back into the CMS because they don't log into the CMS all the time, but they're in their inbox all the time. So if they see items in their inbox that take them back to the CMS, they're more inclined to act on those nudges that you give them. And also, we mentioned this before, one of the most underrated aspects of web governance, in my opinion, is continued user education. Because as we mentioned, governance is not just about restrictions, it's also about making your users more aware and making them more knowledgeable and making them feel more empowered. And a big part of that is ongoing training on writing for the web, on accessibility, on SEO, on your audience, etc. So be sure to provide ongoing CMS training and support so that your users are familiar with the system's features and also with best practices in creating and managing content. So please encourage them to use some of the built-in features that help with that education aspect.
So as we think about these roles that we've defined and how they sort of are connected to each other in the system and their responsibilities, all that is feeding into the publishing workflow. So what sort of tasks are these different roles fulfilling to ensure that web publishing happens? And different roles are going to have different functions in the publishing process, and different content may have different needs for different roles or functions to be involved. It always starts with creating the content, right? So this is an example from some of our governance work where you have content that's created. You have content that's reviewed. So someone is reviewing that. So there's some other role, some other oversight that's reviewing that. Then it's being published. So making sure that the content is viewed, that is published, and you're going to have a sense of what that, this is kind of high level, but like review can entail a lot of things. It can entail, obviously like spelling, accuracy, broken links, things like that. It can also include like brand alignment or relevance or other sort of thematic considerations. Then there's the publishing of the content, and there's monitoring the content. So life begins when you hit publish. That's not the end of the story. That's when the content's life really begins. So as it's going out into the world and doing its thing, you're going to get a lot of data back about where that content's been and who's engaging with it and what it's doing for you. So that monitoring part is a huge part of this content lifecycle. Whatever, if you're using Google Analytics or Site Improve or SEO tools or other things, you're going to be able to learn from the content's performance, and then pull that back in. Then there's the auditing piece that we mentioned. So sometimes that can happen in the CMS platform. You can also, again, like do that sort of just outside the CMS by reviewing content on your site, looking for brand alignment and things like that. So making sure you have a sense of how often are you reviewing certain content. Do you review your programs every year? Do you review your top level pages every year? Are there other pieces of content that should be revised with more frequency? Making sure that for the content you have on your site, and that you're guiding editors who manage other parts of the site to hold themselves accountable to that schedule to make sure that content stays relevant and stays current.
So yeah, workflows are actually one of the most robust measures for your web governance framework. So we encourage the use of whatever CMS you use, encourage their workflow capabilities to set up this review and approval process for content. And this ensures that content is always vetted for quality, accuracy, and of course, compliance with any type of standards before being published out into the wild. And so with Cascade, you have simple approval processes that you can put in place, but also more complex decision structures. So one of the things I would recommend is be sure to map your workflows out on a piece of paper, whether that's a tangible piece of paper or virtual paper, but map them out before trying to implement that in the CMS.
So one of the biggest bottlenecks that can impact your publishing workflow is content requests. So that's when you have people from across the institution who are coming with requests for updating content, adding a page, making some other changes to the website. How that process is set up, the expectations that you're setting, and how you're sort of managing those requests and taking those in is going to have a huge impact on the efficiency of your publishing workflow. In terms of best practices for managing this, you want to create a single channel for fielding website change requests. It could be a form, it could be your ticketing system. What you don't want it to be is your inbox or your DMs or someone hollering over the cube, hey, Kat, could you update the website for me? That is going to create more liabilities and more inefficiencies. Otherwise, even if it's your best friend, the cubicle over, they've got to go through the form, they've got to go through the process. Set expectations for response and delivery. For these types of requests, we do it within X number of business days. We'll confirm this request within X number of hours, or whatever that might be, so that it's not just going into the ether, but you're using this form to begin a conversation. You're not just, this is the difference between being sort of like a reactive kind of like web firefighting team and being a more proactive, strategic web communications team, where you're not just sort of passively taking orders from people around the institution, but you're saying, hey, we can do this, but here's the way in which we do this, and here are the parameters. Set expectations for what info or content a submitter must provide, if it's an image or if it's a link, or what the change is, or whatever that might be. Reinforce that work is prioritized against strategic priority or urgency or timeliness. So if the parking service, if the parking services site needs an update, that's going to fall below something for admissions in April, right? So just making sure that you're communicating that, hey, we prioritize things not based on who came in the door first, but what has more of a strategic priority. I love this example from Campbell University. I'm not affiliated with Campbell at all, but I found this and I love it. They get a lot of information about the person. They get a sense of like, what's the type of service? Is it add a script, add an event? What's the page? Upload the files. What's the urgency? I love this question. Does this impact enrollment or giving? So basically they're saying, hey, those are our strategic priorities here at Campbell University. If you hit no, you're going to go to the bottom of the queue probably, right? And I just love that they are being upfront with that sense of like, hey, we are triaging here, right? Is it tied to an event? What's the deadline? They have some terms and conditions. It's a lot here. And I think that also serves the dual purpose of, number one, giving the web team a lot of information for how to manage that request, but it also kind of communicates to the submitter, like, we own the web. This is serious, and we've created a comprehensive process here, which sort of reflects the seriousness of this. It's not just a graffiti wall where anyone can put stuff up. It's a serious thing. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of content quality assurance, which is a huge part also of governance. So having processes in place to sort of make sure you're maintaining content quality on an ongoing basis. There's different ways you can do this. You can use automated tools, some, third-party tools, some are built into CMS platforms. These can help keep an eye on broken links, spelling, SEO accessibility issues, readability. Then we talked already about, can't talk enough about ongoing content audits. So making sure you have that scheduled, making sure that content stays current, aligned to the brand, aligned to user needs. We talked about core and non-core content. Even for content where it's kind of non-core, like our friends in parking services, you might still have a process of doing spot checks to sort of say like, hey, like what's going on? Might not be part of your regular auditing review rhythm, but just to sort of keep a weather eye on those kind of outlying non-core content sections.
Yeah, and when it comes to QA and the CMS, you always want to show your users action items, right? You don't ever want to overwhelm your users with reports that point out issues that they can't do anything about. We call this technical terror. And so we want to avoid that technical terror. Because if you create this, you will not encourage them to buy into your web governance strategy. So yeah, accessibility, of course, might be your biggest concern because of the legal implications. You also want to ensure, of course, that everyone can navigate your websites and consume your content. So I think a lot of CMSs do a decent job alerting you to WCAG compliance issues. But I think it's also advisable to maybe use dedicated accessibility checkers. In Cascade, for example, we have integrations with the tools SiteImprove and Moncito, and they're highly specialized and they offer additional features that your CMS might not have. So one of the things I really love about SiteImprove is their readability checker. Really important for higher ed to do readability checkers, because it really helps you determine if your content is easily consumable by your target audience. And then another way in which your CMS can help with governance is do the measures that it takes to prevent issues on your pages before you publish them. And these issues can be anything from misspellings or broken links, accessibility, like I mentioned, but also anything that could potentially negatively affect your SEO. And so speaking of SEO, we're all aware of freshness of content. When it comes to SEO, search engines are placing an extreme importance on freshness. So the ability, Georgie just mentioned, review your content, set review dates. So the ability to define what your organization's idea is of stale content for either entire sites or maybe sections of your site, that'll allow your contributors and allow you as well to view the amount of stale content that you currently have on your site. So you can take action and address those issues accordingly. And then on the Cascade side, we talked about this a couple months ago at the user conference. We're actually rolling out SEO tips. And we know that many of you are already using very sophisticated SEO reports outside of the CMS. And we don't want to replace them. We definitely encourage you to keep using them. However, we continue to mention user education here, right? So in the spirit of educating your contributors and really reducing the amount of mitigation work that you or maybe some of your technical or marketing folks have to do, we're providing contributors with things that are in their power to actually help with SEO. So for example, Cascade will show them important metadata that's missing and letting them know about the optimal length. Or it will also point out if maybe a title or a summary that they're using or about to use are already being used elsewhere. So, use your sophisticated tools on a site level, but on a page level, it might make sense to use opportunities to empower your end users to help them with things like SEO by showing them things that they can learn about and things that they can fix themselves. And again, web governance involves keeping your contributors engaged in the CMS and also invested in their content. So I mentioned the daily content report that content owners receive, and they have several additional items that really can help your contributors be more informed, more educated, and help them stay on track. So a quick example here is we have a content health section that shows pages with broken links. It prioritizes them based on how many broken links there are. And also the content report shows you action items, like keep mentioning those action items. And they include tasks that have been assigned to you. Also, maybe this is also a very common problem, maybe drafts that someone has started but hasn't submitted yet, right? So this is content that's in limbo. So be sure that you stay on top and really take advantage of the CMS features that help you with your web governance. And again, not just through restrictions, but also through the aspect of teaching. And that'll help you as content managers and web managers to save time on those pesky mitigation tasks.
So speaking of keeping editors engaged and informed, kind of the last section here is about training, guidelines, and community. So, remember that we had that sort of graphic earlier showing for different governance models, the importance of training and documentation, particularly the more decentralized your model is. But regardless of whether you have 5 editors or 500, training should really be a cultural function and expectation around the web, making sure that, whatever the size of your sort of your team is here, that people should be expected and have an expectation of being supported and having that support provided for them. There's different sort of attributes I would say are important for training, making sure it's accessible so that the documentation is prominent, that training is offered in multiple modalities, that it's consistent, it's regular. I know that it's happening every quarter, every week. It's happening here, it's online. I have an expectation of that when it's going to happen and how to find it. It's comprehensive. It's not just how to use the CMS. It's brand expression, it's accessibility, it's AI, it's web content best practices, whatever is going to be relevant for those folks. It's mandatory. So making sure that you're having, as we said earlier, training as a prerequisite for having access to the CMS, having that training status tracked. Some LMS tools that you might use to sort of host governance resources or documentation. Maybe you want to give people a quiz to allow them to have access. Like I know people who have done that. And that's one way to sort of ensure that people have taken in the training or the documentation. Make sure it's current. So we talked about auditing your web content. You have to audit your training and documentation too. So make sure you have a process for making those living documents and that you're continually revisiting them. Best practices evolve. CMS platforms evolve. You get new features. Make sure your training documentation reflect that. And it's diverse. We are fortunate that there's a lot of great resources out there. Something like lynda.com might have like an intro to information architecture course or something like that. Websites like plainlanguage.gov. There's so much great resources out there. So it's not just all on you to sort of create a whole curriculum, but you can also leverage a lot of freely available expert-driven resources that are out there for public consumption. So when we're thinking about documentation, you might want to think about different types of guidelines to create. So brand guidelines, web writing best practices, voice and tone guidelines, a web content style guide, and then also editorial criteria. So this is something that might be, I think we could also appreciate web writing guides and style guides and things like that, but also publishing and sharing those criteria for what goes on the homepage. How do we make that decision? What is our news content? How can you submit news? What's criteria for being a news story? People in the absence of those criteria might assume that it's a free-for-all, that anything, my pet project book could be the new lead news story on the homepage. Actually, no, because our news is aligned to these brand pillars and our homepage has this purpose and this hierarchy, and here's how we make those decisions, and here's the person who makes them. So really just documenting and defining all that so it doesn't just feel like it's a free-for-all. And then, as I said before, making sure that you are maintaining those documents and documentation and training, and get into a regular rhythm of doing that, just like you would with your web content. Another consideration is an internal content community. So connecting content editors, different folks who have a role in your web publishing, to have peer support, to be able to sort of connect with each other. You might have people in departments who need help, using the newsletter tool, or, where do I find images or things like that. So finding ways that you can, sort of broaden the support you can offer by connecting people to each other. Also, it's a way to sort of model effective site governance. Like, hey, everybody, look what the College of Engineering did. Isn't that great? Be able to celebrate and champion, great accomplishments in web publishing. It also just, you have people together as a community. You could preview changes like, hey, we're going to have a modification to the homepage coming up. Here's a sneak preview. We'd love your feedback. That can just help build buy-in and connection to the overall process by helping them feel like they're not some lone web ranger out there. They're connected to something bigger. Their point of view is important. They're involved. Hey, we've updated our style guide. Here's the link to the, we've changed X, Y, and Z. Here's the link, letting people know when documentation or training has evolved. So, and maybe having regular meetings or presentations, professional development. So there's a lot of value to sort of bringing together your editors into a community that really can help strengthen your governance by making them more informed and educated, and it's creating a more efficient way of engaging with them. So some next steps, want to give you some action items to sort of take away. What are some things that, if you're looking to sort of shore up your governance or sort of get a sense of like where, I don't even know where to start, right? This is a lot, right? But I think, one thing that I always say is like, just start somewhere. You can't boil the ocean. You just got to pick one corner and say, I'm going to work on our training, or I'm going to work on our homepage editorial criteria, or I'm going to work on, making use of these CMS features that we don't use right now. Just pick somewhere. But here's sort of some sample starting points for you. In the next couple of weeks, what you could do, you could document your web content request workflow. How do those come in? You could document how people get access to the CMS. How does that happen anyways? Inventory all the training and documentation you have and all of your website related policies. It's kind of like an intake phase. Then once you have that in place, and within a month or two, you could maybe identify some gaps or liabilities in core content ownership. You could survey your content editors to assess their pain points. Begin talking up governance to leadership. So whether it's sharing reports or data, or just talking about it as a concept, some of the ideas that we shared here today, maybe do a gap analysis of those web policies and processes that you inventory to say, what do we have, what are we lacking? And over time, you could then conduct a content audit of your website to assess content quality. Again, as we said, website issues are often tied to organizational issues. Analyze and document your findings from all these evaluations. Then, propose governance changes to leadership. You've been talking it up. Now you have some ideas and some proposals to share. And then that web content workflow, which can be a huge bottleneck, find ways to optimize that. So that's kind of a sample set of starting points for you. Love to give actionable takeaways. And speaking of action, we are going to leap into action with, you guys have been very busy in the chat. Happy to take the rest of the time to answer any questions.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat right now. There are some questions that are Cascade specific, and I think because of time constraints, I might just respond to y'all in an email because we have Georgy here, and she's such a fantastic subject matter expert that I really want to focus, for the purpose of this meeting here, focus on her expertise here. So one question here for you, Georgy: what is the largest organization this tactic has been applied to? How many contributors and how many pages?
Oh gosh, I mean, so we worked with a large public university that came to us, and it was wildly decentralized. They had 350 subdomains that were just kind of created, like, I think people just walked in off the street and said, I want a subdomain. They're like, sure, here. You can have my cousin's birthday .ourcollege.edu, right? This school has, well over 20,000 student enrollment. I don't recall their enrollment offhand, but they're huge. We did a website redesign project for them, and part of that was thinking about the governance. They said, hey, we don't just want to have a new design. We know that we want to shore up this governance piece. So we had to sort of go through and provide them with guidance on a lot of culture change. Like, hey, it's not going to be a free for all anymore. You're not gonna be able to get a website for your cousin's birthday party. Like, it's just not going to happen. There's going to
Mhm.
be a process. There's going to be roles in place. We're going to have some structure, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable. They had a new brand they were rolling out. So there was a big focus on, just protecting the integrity of that. And part of that means that the digital space couldn't be a free for all anymore. So, we've worked with schools, with small liberal arts colleges, 2,000 students, large public institutions, 20,000 plus. And it's doable for either. But like I said, it's not a one size fits all. There's not like, okay, here's higher ed governance, here's the pamphlet, and just go do this. It requires a lot of, thinking about that organization's culture, where they're at, where they want to go, and building a plan, and having the platform configured in a way that supports that plan.
Very good. This is a funny question, funny in some ways. It was actually for everybody, but I want to ask you too, Georgie. When you have a form, but you still receive content requests via email, does anyone have a respectful method for reminding their colleagues to please use the form?
So please use the form. Here's the link. But I think, I think part of the challenge is like, higher ed is such a collegial environment. Like, I worked in house at two institutions, and you make such good friends and you have such close relationships. You don't want to be the jerk who's saying no or like follow the process. But I think at the end of the day, it really is just, being consistent and saying like, hey, Kat, like, thanks again, I'm glad you want this website updated. Like, as you know, like, this is the link. Like, I know it's a drag, but it really helps us out. Like, thank you so much. Like, you can be a human being about it, but it's not necessarily about being a jerk. It's about making sure that the work gets done in the right way for you, and also the right way for them. If it's in your inbox, it could slip through the cracks. If it gets pulled into a system and a process, with the right information attached to it, that's honestly going to help give that request a better chance of being fulfilled in the way that it's intended. It's about not being reluctant to draw those lines. And I think that sometimes people get a little scared of doing that, but it's kind of a necessity to move things forward and evolve from a governance perspective.
Yeah, I agree. So we talked about education and training throughout this webinar. So a question that we have here is, how do you make training that is comprehensive while keeping the training also succinct and interesting enough to keep people engaged?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I am not an instructional designer, so I am probably not the best person to ask about how to create an effective training program, but I think it's whatever you create, I think it's important to sort of get feedback on it. And if you say, hey, we think that we're going to have, sort of a curriculum, an online curriculum of like 12 different modules that cover topics like accessibility and SEO and this and that and the other thing, and people are going to log in and do it. We think that's going to work great. And then people go through and do it. You're going to have, I think it's important to sort of then survey people, be like, hey, you completed the training. Like, what was that like? Well, how did that work for you? And if people are like, oh, it was the most cumbersome thing in the world, or like, only 10% of your editors actually sign up and do it, or whatever, using that input to then, revisit the process. That's part of that ongoing auditing part we talked about with regard to the training. Is you can't just create it and be like, well, I've created training and I'm never going to think about it again. You're going to get input, and you should seek the input around like, well, did that work? Was that too much, too little? Did it, if people are going to say it's like, it was great, except you didn't cover this thing that's really half of my responsibility. It's half of what I need to do. Okay, that's important feedback, right? So I think you can sort of create a process that you feel covers the bases and isn't too cumbersome. Work with resources that you might have internally who do course design or instructional design or things like that. Leverage those .edu resources around you, but then seek input from the people who take it and be like, hey, did that work for you? And then make any changes and just keep iterating.
Yeah, good points here. Out of curiosity, who typically takes on the role of a web governance officer in a university setting, and what are typically their responsibilities?
I'm going to assume by web governance officer, you mean kind of like the ultimate point person for
Yeah.
sort of owning the website.
Uh-huh.
It's going to depend. Again, there's not sort of like a a cut and dried sense of what those roles and responsibilities are. Part of what we do when we create governance plans for institutions is think through what those roles will be and what those responsibilities need to be unique to that institution. But typically, I think if you have, we kind of call that person the web editor in chief often. It's someone who is kind of like overseeing the execution of that publishing plan, that publishing process. So below them, there's going to be editors and publishers and things like that across the organization. They're
Mhm.
part of the person who is like making sure it's like, okay, does everyone have, the CMS access being managed appropriately? I own the training documentation. Okay, I'm rolling that out. I'm updating that. I'm also accountable to some sort of like an overarching web governance board, which is probably comprised of some folks from leadership, the CMO, whoever that might be, who are sort of telling me, this web editor in chief, web governance officer, whatever you want to call me, hey, like, there's a new brand coming, or like, we're getting feedback that people aren't real, the brand isn't coming through on the program pages, like people need training on writing to the brand, like please make that happen. Or there's less budget, more budget, no budget, that's going to impact things. So, I think that person's kind of sitting at the nexus between the institutional priorities. We talk about sort of those business aspects that get impacted by poor governance, and then also advocating for the needs of the website, and then also sort of overseeing that publishing process. So making sure that that's all running according to plan, and owning that and saying, hey, we're going to change this web content request page to add this criteria or this requirement. That might be that person's role. So, but again, it's kind of tailored to the organization, and how, the roles need to play out to sort of facilitate their publishing needs.
Right. Final question here, and it's a big question. Any pointers you have on how to tackle stale content?
Yeah, I think, we talked about the ongoing auditing piece. Some CMS platforms will have, you can sort of get notifications like this content hasn't been updated in this amount of time. You can get alerts about that. You can also just tell from sort of ongoing like reviews, just going through, okay, I'm going to look through these program pages, or look at the section of the site and seeing, everything saying as of fall 2022, like blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay. So I think the first sort of thing to do is to have some process in place, whether it's automated, manual, or both, for having, ears to the ground about like the status of the content. I think that, if it's something that different editors are responsible for managing, do they have a process in place for tracking when they need to be, do they have a schedule for updating their content? Is that part of their job? Are they just not engaged in that? So it's knowing what content is in need of support, then digging in to say like, well, why is that content out of date? Did that person leave and no one replaced them? Is that editor just like super disengaged? Does that editor like just not have the time? Like they want to do it, but there's other stuff on their plate. So it's kind of a diagnostic approach.
Mhm.
And then it's figuring out like what the solution is. Is it that they need training? Do you need to talk to their manager to sort of impress the importance of this needs to be updated? This is a problem. If it's someone who's just like, I don't want this job, like this is annoying, I don't like doing this, like, some institutions will like, lean into the aspect of like, okay, if we're trying to reach out and help support you and get this web content updated, but you're just like, peace out, I don't care. Is there a consequence? Is there an unpublishing of a page? Or
Right.
like, sorry, chemistry department, like, you guys have been really difficult and we've tried to help and you're just saying no. That's extreme, right? But there's, you want to have like engagement and outreach and conversations before you'd get to that point. But I think it's a sense of like awareness, then kind of diagnostic of like, why is this happening? And then finding the solution. The best case scenario is like, okay, they just need some training or they just need some time. We work and we get that. But obviously, if it's something where it's more problematic than that, then there's more extreme measures that you could take. And then the dean gets mad. You say, well, you should tell them to update the website. And then suddenly they start updating the website. But again, I would say that those are kind of the three phases of how you would tackle that.
Wonderful. Well, sadly, this hour went by way too quickly, and so we're running out of time. But first of all, Georgie, it's been an absolute pleasure co-hosting this webinar with you, and thank you so much for your thoughtfulness and your expertise. Thank you to all the attendees here as well for your very, very insightful questions. And please stay tuned. We're going to follow up with an email here in a couple of days. And don't forget that we have more webinars coming up. Our next one is going to happen on May 22nd, and I'll give you a little teaser here. We'll talk about how you might want to rewrite your personas to better connect with a changing target audience. So good topic here. Once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Georgie, so
Thank you
much.
so much.